10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 261. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 261 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Hope you're all doing well out there, keeping things going, keeping the practicing up, and thank you so much for tuning in for yet another episode. So this week we are going to continue our series on creating more rhythmic flexibility in your playing. And we're going to take a look at the same exercise as last week, but we're going to do it in a slightly different way. Now, before we jump into the show, as always, I want to thank our new patrons. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, this is a listener-supported podcast. We do not have any kind of advertising on the show. And instead, we ask our regular listeners to pitch in a small amount of money each month to keep the show going, and you get some fantastic rewards for those monthly donations in the form of a PDF that goes along with every single episode and some other fantastic rewards. And we do this through the site Patreon, and Patreon is where you can support shows like this. So if you want to get signed up, see what goes along with those monthly memberships, you can go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, and that will bring you over and give you all the information you need. So wanted to give a big shout out to some new $3 patrons. Thank you to Cynthia, George, Nick, and Kieran. And our new $5 patron, thank you to Kevin. And I also want to thank John for editing their pledge from $3 to $5. We really appreciate that. And of course, as always, for everybody that's been signed up for a long time, you know we love you, and you are the reason that we can keep doing this show. So again, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up today. All right, so last week I showed you an exercise that basically took a plain old eighth note bebop line over a major 7 chord, and we really kind of put it through the ringer. We did so many different things with the rhythm where we made the notes longer in each iteration, and what that did was it basically brought you through a whole bunch of different rhythmic schemes and kind of forced you to change the rhythmic scheme without stopping, right? So keeping the same tempo, keeping the same melodic material, but stretching it out over a longer and longer time by changing the eighth notes to quarter notes, then changing those to quarter note triplets, then changing them to dotted quarter notes. If you haven't listened to last episode, go and check that out before we do this week's episode. That's where you're really going to see where the material in this episode comes from. So what we did was we played this exercise with just a plain old metronome. So before we jump into the material from this episode, let's just listen one time to that exercise so you get it back into your head and you kind of hear what we were doing last week. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can hear all of those different rhythmic schemes, right? And how it completely changes the feel of the line that's going on by just stretching it out and thinking about all these different modulations of the particular line. So now what we want to do is I've prepared a backing track, And we want to play it over an actual rhythm section. You could hear in the last example, we were just doing it over a metronome on beat 1 and beat 3. So as we put it into like more of a real life situation, it gets a lot more difficult. And let's talk about why it gets a lot more difficult. So the first thing is that when we're working with a metronome, it's giving us very clear and consistent points of reference. It is consistently giving us beats 1 and beat 3. We can count on that. So when we hear that click, the only question we have to ask ourselves, is this 1 or 3? When we start playing with a real rhythm section that's not predictable, now we have to actually be so comfortable with the material that we don't have to be asking ourselves constantly, where are we in the measure? Now, on this show, we talk about and we practice things that ultimately we want to be able to use in real life. So it only makes sense to practice this stuff with a rhythm section as opposed to a metronome, because in real life, we want to have that rhythmic flexibility when we're actually playing with a band, when we're on stage. Now, the second thing that makes it difficult when we're playing with the rhythm section is that harmonically, these notes from this sort of well-crafted bebop line where everything's happening in a well thought out place, like chord tones happening on the strong beats, as soon as we start to alter the rhythm, harmonically, the notes are falling in very, very different places within the measure. And it's really helpful to hear those notes falling in unexpected places and what that kind of does to the interaction between the notes in the melody and what's going on in the harmony. And this can actually force you out of your comfort zone and force you to hear some notes happening in places where you never would have put them. And you can actually discover some brand new ways to approach line writing simply by hearing it in different places in the measure. Now, it's amazing when I sat down to actually record this, last week when I recorded the exercise with the metronome, it was fairly easy for me. I've worked on this stuff a lot. That's why I feel confident enough to teach you this material. But as soon as I turned on the actual backing track and tried to do it with the rhythm section, ooh, that was hard. That was really hard. It took me many, many tries to nail down a take that I could actually play for all of you. And actually get it right. Okay, so before we discuss this further, let's actually hear what this sounds like over the backing track. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the difficulties that you're gonna have when you play this. Now, some of the rhythmic schemes are going to be a lot easier than others. Like, obviously, the eighth notes aren't going to be that hard. It's just kind of a straight up bebop line. The quarter notes aren't that bad. The quarter note triplets, kind of difficult, especially if you are a little bit uncomfortable with a bunch of quarter note triplets one after another. That can become difficult after a while. The dotted quarter notes, pretty difficult. I think a lot of you will have a little bit of trouble with that until you kind of hear how that settles over 4/4, a bunch of those dotted quarters. The half notes, not that bad. The killer rhythm which at first may not seem like it's going to be the hardest one, is the dotted half notes. This is really, really difficult because basically what you are doing is you're creating a feeling that is what we would call 3/4. So after you do this for a couple of measures, after you play those dotted half notes, it feels like you are playing in 3/4 while the rhythm section is playing in 4/4. And that's what we would call 3/4. And that gets really confusing because you're landing in all different parts of the measure on all different beats as this goes on. And you're going to want to put the beginning of each dotted half note in a place that makes sense to your ears rather than where the next one actually begins. So what you're going to notice when you're playing the dotted half notes over 4/4 is that you're going to want to stretch them or shorten those notes so that they land on the strong beats of the measure, which is 1 and 3. But you have to realize you've got to count each one to its full length, no matter how awkward that feels. So one tip I have for you is at first, isolate the rhythmic values that are giving you trouble. So let's say it's like, quarter note triplets and the dotted half notes that are just really kicking your butt. Pull those out, work on them separately with this backing track, and see if you can start to ultimately grasp that feeling of where everything falls in the measure, and if you can get through that entire sequence of notes. Now, I also want you to notice how different harmonically, like I mentioned earlier, it sounds when the notes fall in different places in each measure, depending on the length of note that we're using. That's going to be the other challenge, and I think ultimately that's going to open up a lot of doors for you when it's combined with this backing track. So this is not easy. And if you need to slow down the backing track a little bit, I am going to include a couple of backing tracks at different tempos for you so that if you're not ready for that 200 BPM tempo yet, you can practice it a little bit more slowly, start to dive in there and dissect where everything goes. But once you're able to do it with the rhythm section, you pretty much know that you've got a good handle on these exercises, and you should see a little bit more freedom in your improvised solos. You should be able to dance around the measures a little bit more, not be tied to those strong beats as much if you've worked on it in the correct way. And that's kind of my ultimate goal for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue this series actually next month, and we're going to go back to our lick of the month, and then as always, we do our tune of the month. So those are going to be coming up next, but then we're going to do a couple of other things with this exercise to make it even more interesting and more difficult next month for 2 weeks, okay? So the part 3 won't be coming out until the month of June, but we're going to get into some other stuff for the remaining episodes in the month of May. Remember, if you have any questions, please get in touch with me on the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Community Facebook group, or you can always email me at 10minutejazzlesson@gmail.com. Remember, if you want to get that exercise and get some of those backing tracks, you can find all of that on our Patreon site, 10minutejazzlesson.com. Click on one of the Patreon banners. Get yourself signed up today. Thank you to everybody that's signed up and has supported this show for a long time. You all are the best. All right, we'll talk to you soon. Hope everybody has a great weekend, is staying safe and healthy out there, and we'll see you next week. Bye.